And good evening to one and all. My name is Donnie Passo. I'm a rabbi and chaplain at Harvard and Harvard Hillel, where I'm also our director of public and alumni programs. It is really an honor this evening to have with us Mark Oppenheimer, and I'm thrilled also to thank our co-hosts and co-sponsors of tonight's program, all the Ivy Hillels, that's Brown, RISD Hillel, Cornell Hillel, the Idkowitz Center for Jewish Campus Life, Center for Jewish Life, Princeton Hillel, Hillel at Dartmouth, the Kraft Center, Columbia Barnard Hillel, Penn Hillel, and Slivka Center at Yale. So thank you all and all of you who are joining from those communities. This evening we have with us Mark Oppenheimer. Mark is the host of the podcasts Unorthodox and Gatecrashers, about the hidden history of Jewish life, Jews in the Ivy League, about which we'll be talking tonight. He's senior editor at Tablet Magazine and has contributed to many publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Mother Jones, The New Republic, and the New York Times, where he was the beliefs columnist. His fifth and latest book, Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood, was reviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Mark holds a PhD in religious studies from Yale University, where he also directed the Yale Journalism Initiative. Mark, thank you so much for joining, and welcome.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.
So for those who are new to our format, Mark and I will have a conversation for about the first half, roughly 30 minutes. Throughout that time, you can ask your questions in the Q&A chat below. Please do so by name. And then if we select you for your question, we'll then invite you to come up, promote you to become a panelist, and then you can ask your question directly to Mark. So that'll be for the second half. Please don't ask a question if you're not willing to come up. We really want to have a chance to feature people. So Mark, I want to begin by asking, you host the podcast Unorthodox, which bills itself as the universe's leading Jewish podcast. I think it is actually the most popular Jewish podcast. So of all the topics in the world, you could go ahead and create a mini series on why Jews in the Ivy League. I know most people on this call who are alumni of Ivy League schools, certainly we're excited about that. But what's kind of the broader relevance? Why?
Right. It's sort of it's a niche topic. My colleagues at Tablet Studios, which is the podcast arm of Tablet, and where I do most of my work, they last year, with no help from me, it was not a project I was pulled into, produced an extraordinary podcast, 8-part series called Radioactive, about Father Charles Coughlin, the extremely important and now overlooked anti-Semitic radio priest of the 1930s, who was one of the biggest celebrities in the country and kind of a leader of the German sympathizing isolationist American right in the 1930s. He packed, I don't know if it was 20 or 30,000 people into Madison Square Garden, cheering for Hitler, cheering for the Nazi cause. He attacked Jews on the radio. They produced a great podcast about him last year called Radioactive. And we were looking to follow up with something about also in keeping with the theme of anti-Semitism, and ways in which it's been overlooked, ways in which we could explore it better. And we were thinking about a number of things. We were thinking about Hollywood. We were thinking Mel Gibson. We were thinking, something in the 19th century, Civil War era, Leo Frank, of course. And then one day I was just walking along and I thought, if we did Jews in the Ivy League, first of all, I know there's something there because better scholars than I have produced a paper trail and important books on the history of Jewish exclusion and minority exclusion from the Ivy Leagues. And second of all, I thought it maps neatly onto 8 episodes because they're 8 schools. So it just seemed like, and then once I thought of it, and then of course there's the fact that, as I learned when I was a student and a teacher at Yale, if you cough at Yale or Harvard or Princeton or Cornell or Penn, the media descends. And so it struck me as something that would get some attention outside the Ivy League, even though it was somewhat incestuously about the Ivy League.
So turning to your podcast now, if you look at schools with larger populations in the first half of the 20th century, larger Jewish populations, like City College, they were outstanding schools. You have tons of students there who regularly won things like the Putnam math competition. I think there are about 10 or so alumni from the 30s, 40s, and 50s from City College that went on to win Nobel Prizes. Why was it significant for Jews then to go to the Ivies? They seem to be succeeding at these other schools. what was the meaning? What did it mean for a Jew to get into
Yeah.
an Ivy League school?
Well,
Yeah.
first of all, we have to remember that in before the 20th century, if you're looking at the 1890s or 1900, you're talking about a country in which well under 10% of the people went to college, and in which no college, no university or higher education institution was very selective in the United States. Um, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, these places accepted, 40, 50, 60% or more of those who applied. They weren't particularly expensive. They were exclusive only in that the people who chose to pursue that kind of education in Latin or Greek or Christian studies or whatever were from the Protestant elite. You didn't go to become a lawyer. Abe Lincoln did that without formal schooling. You didn't go if you needed to go into business for yourself. You went if you had time to kill, to study the classics, again, ancient classics, more modern classics, Christian theology. Um, and then you could go into your father's business. It was for the landed gentry, the Protestant landed gentry. So look, it wasn't these weren't the most intellectual places, but they certainly had a lot of prestige, and they had beautiful campuses. They had a lot of prestige. In the case of a place like Dartmouth, the idea for a Jew who was one generation removed from the pogroms to go to a school that beautiful, and to have that life of skiing and a cappella singing and drinking, that was in some ways a better college life for many people than City College of just commuting to school and grinding away. So Jews wanted to go to these schools for the same reason that many humans still prefer going to Princeton over City College, which is they're more appealing in certain ways, and they're more exclusive and elite. And so the other thing to remember, of course, is that if you're looking at Columbia, which was the first to have a so-called Jewish problem, to be first of the Ivies to have a very large number of Jews, um, it was another very fine school within New York City. So, and you could commute there. A lot of Jews were commuter students there in the tens and twenties and thirties. So again, if you didn't want to go to City College, or NYU, Columbia, which was not prohibitively expensive, began to look like a very appealing option. The last thing I would say is that, although many Jews went to these schools and majored in economics or math or the kind of stuff that might seem more useful, a lot of them went and read Shakespeare. And the culture of these schools promoted that in a way that, again, maybe City College or other, much more pre-professional schools didn't. So Jews wanted to go there for the same reasons that Protestants wanted to go there.
And when you say over time, has the interest in going to an Ivy League school changed, and the meaning of what it meant for a Jew to go from, say, the earlier part of the 20th
Well,
century until
I
today?
mean, sure, Jews today are, large, with some exceptions, especially in, say, the Russian or Persian communities, many of whom have immigrated more recently. But the large majority of Jews today are third or fourth or fifth or sixth generation. Excuse me. And, the idea of it's not crashing the gates to go to the Ivy League now. Uh, Peak Jew in the Ivy League was probably in the 80s and 90s, and people I graduated from Yale with in 94, 90, I'm class of 96, 94, 95, 96 are now the parents of children who were there. I mean, we're now legacies. So the idea that it's overcoming some sort of barrier, has gone away. Also, I think Jews on average are not as academically ambitious. The average Jewish 14-year-old does not have the immigrant drive that his or her great great grandparent or great grandparent had. So we are in all sorts of ways perfectly mediocre Americans, and that's in some ways a huge accomplishment.
So you talk about that. I think it's in the last episode, which focuses on Harvard, but also sort of the decline of the Jewish population overall.
Yeah.
And you attribute that at one point to this declining work ethic. Uh, I'm curious to hear more about that. What makes you so certain about that? I think, for many people, probably many on this call, they would probably look to something like the Supreme Court case going on right now with Harvard to say that Harvard now seeks a more diverse community, and Jews, if they're 10 or 12%, are already overrepresented, sort of fivefold in the broader population. Yeah, so what makes you say that? I mean, do you think if we still had the work ethic of the early part of the 20th century, we'd be at 20 to 25% Jewish?
No, well, okay, so this is really interesting, and I imagine it's the interest of a lot of people on this seminar, and I'm glad you got to it. We know that numbers of Jews in the Ivy League have plunged. We don't know, and there's no way to know, and you'd have to first of all agree on who's a Jew and who's not. But broadly speaking, you could say that a place like Harvard in 1985 or 95 was about 25% Jewish. Harvard College, undergraduate school. Some of the professional schools would have been more Jewish, some less. But let's talk about Harvard College. And similarly, this would be true at Yale. There's differences at various schools, but let's say a quarter at Harvard and Yale in 1985 or 1995. Why is it lower today? It is lower for a whole host of reasons. And I'm going to list, this is not in any particular order, but I'm going to bracket the sort of diversity question. Are we being squeezed out as kind of normative white people in favor of underrepresented groups, minorities, whatever, people of color, whatever you want to call them, which I know is the fear, the sense, the worry, the hope, whatever, of different people. But they figure that's what's happening, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I actually think that everything counts, everything is a factor somehow, but let's talk about other factors. Number one, the United States the Jewish population in America probably was over 3% in 1920 or 1930 because of recent waves of immigration. There were surveys that showed 3.5% at various points. It is now arguably 2% at the most. Now, these sound like trivial differences, but what it means is our percentage in the population may have dropped by 25 or 50%. And a growing number of those who are in that population are Haredi or Orthodox, and the Haredim, by and large, would not be interested in a place like Harvard. And many of the modern Orthodox would be interested, but have other schools that have prestige for other reasons. So a top student might choose Yeshiva or the University of Maryland for its Jewish culture, for its Hillel, et cetera. So that rump of Reform and conservative and secular Jews, mainstreaming, assimilating, Americanized American Jews, is substantially smaller as a percentage of the population than it was 30 or 40 or 60 years ago. Which means if all else stayed the same, you still would expect that Harvard wouldn't be 25% Jewish. Today, maybe it would be 17 or 18% Jewish. Like a huge percentage of the difference can be accounted for by the shrinking percentage of Jews in the population. Then, when you consider that, again, to the point that the Reform and conservative population, which was always the kind of the feeder, right, has really crashed, you might expect it to be even lower. Then when you realize that Jews have dispersed away from these historically Jewish neighborhoods and suburbs that had these extraordinary public schools. I'm talking Brookline High, Newton North and South, Skokie, Bethesda, Chevy Chase out. These places were sending, once Jews had crashed through the gates and quotas were lifted in the 70s, 80s, 90s, these were schools that could get 5, 6, 10, 15 kids a year into Harvard or Yale. They were super elite places. Jews are now Jews are not clustering in those suburbs anymore. Their parents are going to other places where there's a good lacrosse youth program, where you can get a 3-car garage, where the property taxes are lower. So even if you take the same kid, you're putting him into high schools that are by and large somewhat less competitive and less driven toward the Ivy League. So there's all of these reasons. Then you have to say about the kids, if they're only quarter or a half Jewish, they may get to campus and then not identify. So, and then of course, there is the fact that, yes, schools are looking for other minority groups. So Harvard, for example, I think in 1989 or 90, or even later, was 5% Jewish. Very recently, in my lifetime, it was 5% Jewish, 5% Black. The United States is 12 or 13% Black, and Harvard is now 13 or 14. It is caught up so that it's now saying we want as many Blacks at Harvard as there are in the population. So that is certainly, to some extent, when any group grows, it may grow at the expense of another one. But it's also very likely that if all of the diversity aspirations went away, affirmative action, geographical diversity, whatever, that what would happen is the number of Asian Americans might go up substantially at the expense of all other groups. In other words, if Harvard is currently 7 or 8% Jewish, and you took away all the other sort of what you might call artificial, fingers on the scale, it might go down to 4 or 5 or 6, because the Asians might bump up from 28% to 35 or 40 or 43, like the freshman class at UC Berkeley right now. So the idea that it's like, if you took all these other things away, Jews would go up, we might actually go down if we were left to just our SATs and grades. And one final point, it may be, now that Jews are the legacies, right? Now that a lot of Jews at Yale, I know, for example, every Jewish kid I know there, and I recently stopped teaching there, had a mom or dad who went there. We might be the new WASPs. That is, our numbers might be artificially inflated because of legacy preference. We might be so mediocre that if not for legacy preference, or the fact that increasing numbers of Jews are recruitable athletes, that we might crash down to 2 or 3 or 4%. So we have a myth in our minds that we're still fabulous. And if you took all these artificial barriers away, we'd be back at 25%. But everything in the world militates against that.
Wow. So thank you for really that thorough answer, all those different points. Um, so I'm curious a little bit about, I sort of see that there are three different models for how a Jewish community can exist or what it can strive for on campus. And I think we can sort of actually come up with three different ways of thinking about food that address this. So one would be, just wanting to be a regular member of the college. So I think
Yeah.
of the Bicker episode with Princeton. Just want to be able to eat in a regular standard Princeton eating club. So full integration. The second I think of as more the episode you did on Brown with Mrs. Smith's kitchen, right? Which is we want access to kosher food or something else that is distinctly Jewish.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we kind of just want to be members of the campus community. And the third, which I think exists certainly at Harvard Hillel and many other places now, is we are the dining hall that exists at Harvard Hillel is part of the Harvard dining plan. Anyone can come eat, Jewish, not Jewish, kosher, not kosher. And as a result, we end up sharing a lot more of what Judaism is with a much broader
Yeah.
community. So I think of, Cory Booker, I think he got this actually more at Oxford. But when he gave a commencement speech at Yale, he said, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to give a Dvar Torah. So Cory Booker, who's not Jewish, uses the Hebrew words for a certain kind of Jewish homily because he encountered Judaism on campus. So I'm curious, over time of those three different models, have you seen a shift or different schools? Is there a different emphasis on sort of what are the objectives that Jews have sought when they come to campus? Integration, having their needs met,
Yeah.
or kind of being ambassadors for Judaism?
Well, I think it's always been all three. I mean, there's a myth that, for example, all the Jews who were coming in the 20s and 30s were these highly assimilationist Jews. It turns out that there were Jewish services at Princeton going way, way back. It turns out that there were, they were bringing rabbis in from Newark and Trenton to have a distinctly Jewish life. They would print the names of the Jewish boys in the newspaper, or they would print the names of Jewish boys and their escorts to local, B'nai B'rith parties in the paper. Jewish girls, women could date the Jewish boys or men from Princeton. Girls would come down from Rutgers. There was this was of course in the days when intermarriage was still, generally frowned upon within the Jewish community. It was not as much of a social fact. So there was more distinct identifying even 100 years ago when Jews kept their heads down more than we think. I also think that you had all three of these when Jewish numbers were so high. I mean, these days, what you'll hear more of, and you could speak to this at Harvard, is the fear that Hillel becomes a place for the Orthodox or the very serious. The Orthodox, the people who have done a gap year in Israel, the people who were raised in youth movements, that fewer and fewer Jews walk in for Friday night dinners who are just kind of casually Jewish and intrigued, and that the place there's a kind of segregation. I think, that, and I've heard this story from a number of schools, that peak integration of like Hillel's another dining hall where people can come and there's cultural intercourse was, probably the 90s, mid 80s to the early aughts, let's say 85 to 2005, when the Slifka Center opened at Yale in the fall of 95, and I was a senior. I remember the Kosher Kitchen Friday nights getting a couple hundred people, probably half of whom were Jews, and the other half were friends or roommates of those Jews. And everyone was learning how to sing Shalom Aleichem, and everyone stuck around for benching for the prayers afterwards and for more songs. And it was a very cool place for Gentiles to be. And I do think that the shrinking number of Jews at these schools means there are fewer unwitting ambassadors out to the Gentile community. I think that Israel politics has made some people wary, Jews and others, of organized Jewish life. And also there's a kind of ineffable thing that I don't think has anything to do with Israel politics, which is simply that, starting in the 1950s and petering out maybe around 2000 or a little after, Jews were in many ways a very chic minority. They were seen as, historically oppressed, but also resilient and funny and smart. They were seen as kind of having tradition, but also being politically progressive. They were exalted, often in some ways that might make one uncomfortable. But it was Jews were culturally chic in a certain way, and other other marginalized groups and minorities have moved into that position, and it's often very cyclical. I mean, I remember a moment, you see this in literature, which is my field, right? That there will be several years when everyone's paying attention to certain South Asian authors, and then that will move on, and then people are paying attention to authors from this group. And, the I think a lot of people are very intrigued by who from Native traditions is writing now, Native American authors, self-identified Indian authors, et cetera. And that's a good thing, that's healthy. But it also means that the kind of Irenic or Edenic, Eden-like days of the 80s and 90s for Jewish communal life on largely Gentile campuses is past. I mean, there just aren't as many Gentiles who want to soak up some Yiddishkeit as there once were.
I want to remind our audience we'll have time shortly to move to the second half of tonight's program, Q&A from you. You can click on the Q&A icon down below and type in your question. If we select your question, we'll invite you to actually become a panelist and ask your question directly, audio and video, on to Mark. So please only ask a question if you have an interest in doing that. Mark, you mentioned Israel now, and Israel comes up a couple of different points throughout your podcast, but it's not a real feature. And I was curious about that because I tell people I work on a college campus, work in Harvard. Almost the first thing they'll ask about is Israel and the mood about Israel on campus and what that's like. So I'm curious, what was the decision not to focus much on Israel? Was that sort of based from you, or did that come from what you were hearing
Yeah.
from?
Well, the podcast is largely historical, right? So certainly in the Cornell episode, you heard where we were talking about off-campus Havurah in Ithaca, New York. Um, they talked about what a safe, to use the terminology we would use today, of how good it was to have a safe space on campus to talk about how scared they were in 1973, when Israel was at war. And it was Israel, and then of course the Russian Jewry movement was a very live movement for them, and those Jews principally went to Israel and the United States when they got out. So, we looked at it throughout history when it was applicable. No Jew at Dartmouth in 1958, when we looked at that class, was thinking much about Israel, I don't think, or none of them said that they did. Um, we landed in episode 8, and this was always by design. We decided we were going to land at Harvard and look at what it was like to be Jewish there today. And unsurprisingly to me, and we interviewed a lot of students, most of them off the record and didn't end up on the tape, but we talked to a lot of people. Unsurprisingly to me, because I just finished 15 years teaching at Yale, um, you know, parents and others who talk about this stuff, God help them, in Facebook groups for high school seniors applying to college or whatever, think that there's just sort of unremitting anti-Israel dialogue and anti-Jewish sentiment on these campuses. And of course, there's not. And the reason that most, although there's some, the reason that most Jews might stay away from Jewish communal life is not because of Israel. There's a kind of like thin line of Jews who might leap over into being involved, except that they're concerned about the politics of Israel or Hillel or Chabad or whatever. But on the other side of them, way behind them, playing hacky sack and frisbee in Harvard Yard, are just like hundreds of Jews who are not particularly interested, and it's because they're disengaged. Often they are unlearned. They don't know much about Israel. They don't know much about their own Judaism, or they do but aren't interested in it, or have made a choice to take a vacation from thinking about it for 4 years of college. College is a time when a lot of kids who are raised in kind of very rich, textured, ethnic or traditional communities walk out of those communities, and while their parents aren't watching, see what it's like to date someone who's not from that community, or to not keep kosher or whatever. So, the real, if you want to put it in these terms, and I don't normally, but just for the sake of bluntness, the culprit of disengagement is much more the lack of interest or lack of knowledge on the part of the students than it is their perception of anti-Semitism or Judeopathy.
So thinking about that and transitioning slightly, you have an op-ed in today's New York Times about a report.
How do you like that? I try to time my New York Times op-eds to days when I'm going to talk to you. Like,
It's
I
beautiful.
actually
We've actually had a
hold it for the
number of
day when I'm
speakers
talking to
that's
Donnie.
happened. So we definitely appreciate that. And
Sure.
so in this piece, which I highly encourage everyone to take a look at, you reference a report released in September by Stanford, in which it admits to discriminating against Jews in admissions. How important do you think this report is, and why?
Well, what I said was, it's nice of them to admit it. They came a little late to the party. Yale and Columbia and Harvard were figuring out how to use geographical diversity and high school selection to keep Jews out back in the 20s. I mean, so just to give people some background, what Stanford did in the 50s was they realized, oh, we have more Jews than we want. It wasn't so many compared to other schools. It was 10 or 15% or something. And they said, if we want to cut back on them, just don't admit so many kids from Fairfax High School in LA or Beverly Hills High School. Like there's certain high schools that are sending us 10 or 20, 30 kids a year, almost all of whom are Jews. Just don't recruit at those high schools. Don't admit kids from those high schools. You've solved your Jewish problem, which by the way, was a tactic that the Ivy League schools were using. Until the 1970s, almost no people were going to Yale from Bronx Science, which had, more brain power than almost any high school in the world, because Yale College wasn't interested in math and science oriented, largely Jewish, boys. Bronx Science may have been co-ed, so Stuyvesant was all boys for most of its history. So anyway, Stanford figured out just be selective about the schools you look at, and you will, in effect, imposing a Jewish quota. I said it's nice of them to admit that. Their proposed solution. They apologized. I don't care much. I don't care if people apologize for stuff that was done 70 years ago by their predecessors. I mean, I think apology culture has been largely debased, but it was well-meaning, and it's not clear whom the apology is to, which I think it's interesting, like looking at the way Maimonides talks about apologies and how you do it in Jewish culture. They're very much to a human being who you wronged. They aren't kind of public performances of chest beating, but look, it was nice of Stanford. I think it was well-meaning. I think the report is well-written and well-researched. What I said was, if you want to do something important now, you have kosher food already. Maybe it could be better. You could be better about making sure that Shabbos observant kids don't have to use their key cards to get into buildings on the Sabbath. Great. That's an issue at all campuses with Jews. But if you really want to do something, make people learn the humanities, make people know history. Stanford's a place where I once taught a class in the Jewish American novel, and my students overwhelmingly said who were great students, by the way, and loved the class. I think just they loved the material. They loved reading these people, irrespective of my teaching. But they all told me, well, you could, I would say, why don't you major in history or literature or Jewish studies? Oh, you can't do that. I mean, they all had to found their own startup. They were majoring in computer science, biomechanical engineering, whatever. And Stanford's a profoundly anti-humanities place.
That was my major as undergrad.
What's that?
Biomechanical engineering was my major.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, good people can come out of any major, but most of these schools, the number of English majors has just crashed, or history majors is just falling. And so I don't know. I mean, what all these schools should do is ensure that no one gets out of school without having a proper liberal arts education, but they're too consumerist to actually have the courage to require lots of classes of their students.
So I've got a question about, you mentioned in your last episode that this declining percentage of Jews may not actually be something we should be so concerned about. But as anti-Semitism rises, and you mentioned that potentially through particular courses, we can aid the people who are ignorant and therefore combat anti-Semitism. But I would imagine also just getting to know Jews is a way of combating anti-Semitism. And given that so many graduates of Ivy schools will be leaders in government, politics, and business, might we actually want to be a little more concerned about this declining population?
So, I mean, so you're saying, given that so many graduates of Harvard go on to have a lot of influence, shouldn't we be worried if they're not brushing up against Jews in their college experience?
I mean, I wouldn't put it as crassly, but just to say,
I mean, I'm always very wary of the diversity rationale that says that it's the job of certain people to sort of civilize the people around them, because most undergrads, like most human beings, are basically like well-meaning mediocrities. I think I'm basically a well-meaning mediocrity. I'm not sure that like knowing me makes someone less anti-Semitic or more cultured. I hear what you're saying, that if college is a Judenrein world for them with no Jews in it, they might be less well equipped to kind of think compassionately about Jews afterwards. I think that's true. But ultimately, like, it's sort of a losing game because we're 2% of the population. And, there aren't enough of us to go around to do that work at Michigan and UCLA and Columbia and whatever. So it's really, that's hard.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn to our audience.
Can you give me a 15-second break? One of my kids needs me for 1 second.
Absolutely.
So just everyone go take a drink.
I'll take this as an opportunity to share with our audience two upcoming programs we'll be having. Um, the first is next week on Thursday night. We're going to be meeting and hearing from Nick Lehman, who is former dean of the journalism school at Columbia and is also a writer for the New Yorker, staff writer there. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be hosting two co-directors of Nick Burns's recent documentary on the United States and the Holocaust. You'll be receiving some information about those right after this evening's panel.
I'm back. I may get
Great,
joined by a 4-year-old in a moment who was supposed to be in
great.
bed, but
Okay,
if so, you'll see that podcasters have kids too.
great. Um, So it's still sticking on this op-ed. You wrote today, I'm quoting, in September, the Wellesley student newspaper published an editorial that relied on the blatantly anti-Semitic mapping project, a crude website that implies that institutions in Massachusetts, including Emerson, Tufts, and Harvard, the Boston area Jewish high school, and even the public school system, are part of a web of conspiratorial Zionism. In a clear response to editorial, Wellesley's president, Paula Johnson, condemned the mapping project. In today's Harvard Crimson, the editorial board wrote the following, I'm quoting, "We don't stand for or support the mapping project. Neither, for that matter, does the unaffiliated Palestinian BDS National Committee. As student journalists, however, we firmly support the editors of the Wellesley News editorial board." I think they're making an argument for free speech. We have an active student who unfortunately can't be here this evening who wrote a dissenting opinion there. But I'm curious, I think for many students, they'll see something like this and they get bombarded with these minor things here or there, but it can create an experience on campus that can feel hostile. So how would you coach a student who came to you and said they read this op-ed or they read this editorial and they're concerned?
I wouldn't, the editor on the Crimson, I mean, I wouldn't know how to coach a Harvard student how to feel better. I know how I parent my own children. Hi, David. You want to come in and sit with me while I talk to these nice people? David's going to sit with me for a second. Um, this is his elephant, Mr. Boone. So, you know, I mean, with my own children, what I try to make sure is that they know something of their culture's history, that they're firmly grounded in, sort of Jewish practice, that they, that they do mitzvot within their community. I think that if Judaism to you is that you show up for Shiva when people need you, and that you help make meals for new parents, and that that you think your place on Shabbos is in shul, or at least sometimes, or is somehow in community with other Jews. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff seems a lot less urgent. I mean, I think that part of the problem, and by the way, I was a deeply unknowledgeable and when I got to Yale, uncurious Jew, and I think that part of if you look at any minority culture, whether it's queer culture, African American culture, Jewish culture, whatever, a lot of the self-care you have to do, to use a word I don't like, I can't believe I just used that, is to know who you are and what the culture means to you, and something of its history and something of its worth. And that's about self-esteem. That's about amour propre, as the French would say, like just the sort of the love of the self. And if Jews have that, then, and I don't mean to minimize times when they might feel like bodily threatened. Anti-Semitism can be very scary. I wrote a book on the Tree of Life shooting, so I don't have my head in the sand about that. But in terms of the sort of ambient ignorance of Jews, or the stupid kind of social media fueled disdain for Jews, or the most ignorant kinds of criticism of Israel, if you know better and know who you are, then it is easier to ignore that stuff and walk away from that stuff. So I don't think it's not a talk you give your kid when they go off to college. It's a life in which you've raised them as best you can, and parenting is a tricky thing. And I have at least one failure a day, but as best you can, to be people who are honored to be Jews, who are honored to be heirs of of ethical monotheism and the great intergenerational book club that we call Judaism, that rereads this one great book in its book club on an annual cycle. If that's what it is to you, the Crimson editorial just doesn't seem that big.
Okay. Well, thank you for that and for all your questions or answers this evening. We're going to turn now to our audience. First up is David Muller, who's an alum of Brown. David, you should be able to turn on your audio and video and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks. Really interesting. So I had a question more on what happens when a Jew got to an Ivy League school. And the example I wanted to use is my dad was a German immigrant, arrived in the US in 41 and ended up at Brown starting in 1948. And Jews weren't allowed into fraternities. There were no fraternities that really accepted Brown, but there was something called the Tower Club, which was kind of a social club that accepted Jews. Clearly, that's changed over the decades, but what was the pace of that change? How did the Jews penetrate? What was that traditional WASPy social network that was
Yeah.
really insular, but was the social life on campus at the time?
Well,
Thanks.
one of the things you have to remember is there's pre-war and post-war. So pre-war, these places really were, slightly beautiful but ridiculous schools out of like a Fitzgerald novel, out of Gatsby or something. I mean, they were, Columbia, although it became 25 or 30 or even 40% Jewish very rapidly in the teens and 20s, but the Protestant elites who were there and who had been there, let's say in the 1890s, 1900, 1910, and whom they wanted to return the school to were Knickerbockers, were New York banking families of Anglo-Dutch ancestry who were concerned with cotillions and summers in Newport and so forth and so on. And there were very few financial aid students. They were not democratic places. They were and they were not intellectual places. And indeed, they would reject a student by saying this student seems too intellectual. They'll just be doing homework all the time when they should be doing a cappella singing or rowing crew or fraternity rush or doing a silly skit or something. They were playgrounds for the rich. After World War II, so we think the change came in the 60s and 70s with civil rights, with the end of the Jewish quotas, but really after World War II, these places, most of the change happened, which was at Yale, for example, the World War II generation returned, a lot of veterans from poor and working class backgrounds or middle class but not rich backgrounds, and flooded these places, and there was great concern about this. And in fact, at Yale, they imposed a dress code, coat and tie, in the dining hall after World War II. They'd never felt the need to before. But after World War II, there were so many ruffians and hooligans from the farm or from, an Irish background in New York and in Queens that they felt we better tell these people to dress up. We better civilize them. And then in 1962 with Sputnik, or was Sputnik 59? Anyway, the report at Yale came out in 62. There was a report they did. And stuff like this happened in a lot of Ivies where they said, if we don't want to lose the space race to Russia, I mean, they became panicked in the Cold War. And the university said, we better actually do intellectual work. So the kind of scientific study that had been going on at MIT or Chicago or City College, all of a sudden Brown and Yale and Princeton said, we better have it serious labs and we better start taking kids from serious science backgrounds. And so that really, 1959-60 with the Cold War rhetoric, and then of course civil rights is happening. So 48 is a very interesting time to be there because things were about to really democratize. And what I will say is that at all of these schools, there were some anti-Semitic and maybe even mostly anti-Semitic social clubs and fraternities, but there were always some that took a Jew or two or three if who was interested. It was often a clubbable Jew who had gone to a prep school and played, lacrosse. It was often the right kind of Jew. And that's another distinction that you see. So at Princeton in the eating clubs, look, if you were Jewish but you'd gone to prep school and you played sports, they were actually fine with you. But if you were Jewish and you came out of Hoboken or Queens public high school and didn't play, and your activity was debate or model Congress or science or chess club, you were not their kind of Jew. And that's the distinction you see in the 40s and 50s.
Great. Thanks very much.
You bet.
David, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go now to Solomon Israel. Solomon's an alum of Penn, University of Pennsylvania. Hi, Solomon. Welcome.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you, Mark, for giving us your time. My question really was, and you answered a little bit of it, around the declining numbers. And really from the standpoint of as an alum and as a legacy who has a child that is now in the process of applying, it's really a question of the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish rhetoric that you start to see. And it's more of the supply side of the, I'm curious as to whether the declining numbers are not just a function of reduced numbers from an overall population standpoint, but also as a function of the fact that they are less attractive places to be. And even when I was at Penn, I saw some of this, but certainly if I look at the West Coast, some of the schools there are almost notorious now for being blatant in an anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist method.
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, look, I've gotten this question a lot. I've also had another form of it, which is these schools have gotten so expensive. Maybe Jews are staying away because they're choosing better, lower cost options, which strikes me as absurd because Jews are still a fairly wealthy group. They'd be more able, they're less likely to be scared off by the cost than most ethnic groups, right? But to your question, I I think again, there's this sliver of people, of parents and kids, who are Jewishly engaged and have a perspective on Israel, and will be attuned to something like a Crimson editorial or what just happened at Berkeley Law School, at UC Berkeley Law School, where a number of student groups said they would not host Zionist speakers. So again, if you're from that sliver, you're Jewishly engaged, you went to shul, your family Zionist, you went to youth group, you're whatever, your social group was Jewish, and that matters to you, some percentage of that small percentage of applicants will then stay away. Though even those applicants, I think most of them are prestige whores because most Americans are prestige whores. And so the idea that there are many Jews who would turn down or not apply to Harvard and Stanford and Princeton because of the Israel situation and would say, no, I'm going to go to, Maryland or Binghamton because it has less of an anti-Zionism problem. I just think that's not a huge population because most people are more into prestige and status than that. Most Jews and most non-Jews. So that's my take on it. But I could be wrong. I don't know how I would get data on that. I hear a lot of people saying, could it be the case that I haven't met but one person for whom it was the case that they didn't apply to an elite school because of perceived anti-Semitism?
Well, I'll just say anecdotally, because it's
Yeah.
not a survey, right? I have observed from a number of my peer group that we have all kids in the same age sector that have looked at seeing what's going on Berkeley, looking at what's going on in California. And I think the thing to be careful of, it's not just a matter of it is also a matter of an identity and association discussion that comes into play as far as saying it's okay, where students are actually can be fearful of expressing that part of their identity, and identity is a multifaceted piece. So
absolutely. Look, these things would be impossible to know for certain because even people living them don't know their motivations so well. I don't discount any of that, but I always want to foreground that remember that a vast majority of American Jewry and a growing percentage of American Jewry doesn't care about Judaism, Israel, or Jewishness. And they don't care. And those people were always super important to the numbers. When you talk about Harvard being 25% Jewish in 1985 or 95, most of those were students who didn't care about any of this stuff because they were assimilated Americans, just like Chinese can be assimilated Americans, just like, Iranian immigrants can be assimilated Americans. So we who are on a call like this are heavily skewed towards the kind of people, the kind of Jew who's interested in these questions. That is a minority position in American Jewry. Just is. Look at affiliation with synagogues. I mean, the kind of people who care about these questions are probably likely at least to have parents who joined, but most American Jews don't have parents who even paid temple dues. So for what that's worth, but you're not wrong.
I think you got to watch that, and I will yield because I don't want to occupy all the time here in the process.
Thank you, Solomon. We appreciate it, and thank you for joining. We're going to go to Nadine Jacobson, who's an alumna
Hi.
of Harvard. Nadine, welcome.
Hi, and hi, David. I hope you're going to sleep. So cute. I remember those days. So
Yeah.
I have a son who just started at Michigan, and I have twin daughters who are in high school, juniors looking around. And for me, I want to know, is the population of Jews crashing not just in the Ivy League, but is it crashing at all the other schools too, like the places that do have a lot of Jews, like Binghamton or Maryland or Michigan, or is it they're falling out of the Ivy League and it's increasing at other places? Because for me, I'm not really a prestige whore. My son didn't even apply to Harvard, even though he possibly could have gotten in. He got into Michigan after all. But I think that for me, what I want is, what if you are the committed Jew? My kids went to day school. They're strongly committed Jewish, or at least we're very oriented to that. And I want them to be in a place where they can date other Jews, where there's enough critical mass of Jewish people that they can find the Jews they want to socialize with and marry and date. Because it's important at this age to form those relationships. Those become your friends who help you later on find mates. And it was helpful to me when I was at Harvard in 85, but yeah, it was so Jewish. That was great. But I want that for my kids, and I don't know where to send them that they can have that. Even if it's not the Ivy League, I don't particularly care about.
I'm thinking of an Israeli friend of mine who would say, you've just made the case for Aliyah.
Hey, I used to live in Israel. They've got problems there.
So, I mean, look, the number and also the percentage, but possibly even the absolute number of non-Orthodox and certainly non-Haredi American Jews is declining. And unless through some game theory way they begin to sift themselves into a smaller number of more concentrated schools, they are going to remain dispersed, and there will be fewer schools where there will be that kind of critical mass. It's like there's a reason single people want to live in big cities, right? So that is true. I don't know the numbers at, say, Michigan. What I can tell you, and let me say two things on this. One is not all Ivy League schools are the same in terms of selectivity. Penn is an extraordinary school and highly selective, but it's not as selective as Harvard or Princeton, and it used to have a much bigger Hillel. Even at Penn, where they thought 25 or 30% of the school was Jewish 20 years ago, it's now probably half that or lower. So I have to assume that if you sort of go to highly selective schools right outside the Ivy League as well, a Michigan, a Binghamton, that the numbers are lower. There are fewer Reformed conservative Jews who identify as Jews showing up on college campuses as first years, as freshmen. Now, that said, there are some growing and thriving Hillels. Florida, I think, has the largest Hillel, University of Florida. Donnie might know this better than I, but like Hillel International has statistics on where the Jews are.
Yes.
And the scene at University of Florida is very different from the scene at Harvard. In some ways, you could probably intuit at a major football school and fraternity school. They have a lot of Jews there. Arizona has a lot of Jews. But I don't know the numbers on a place like, say, Michigan.
Yeah, I just wonder that, with the Ivy League, you said that it's really because the proportion of Jews is going down. It's not because other ethnic groups are being, increasing at the loss of the Jews, but it's a little of both. It feels very much like it's both.
It is both, but I also will say, like, don't discount our own mediocrity. We think that if there were no affirmative action for other groups, our numbers would be much, much higher. They could be lower. It could be that South Asians and East Asians would take a further bite, that there is academic success. Latter-day Saints, Mormons, highly academically successful. These things, of course, all flatten out the fact that in every ethnic group, they're extraordinary, wonderful students. They also flatten out the fact that the country is 3 times the size it was in 1920. I mean, I make this point on the Harvard episode of the podcast. In 1920, there were 110 million Americans and 8 Ivy League schools. There are now literally precisely 3 times as many, 330 million Americans.
And many more people are applying to college than were.
And many more people are applying to college. And these schools now are all 10% international. They all look outside the United States for people. So the idea that we could possibly have our numbers that we had in 1925, when Harvard was a quarter Jewish, before they smooshed it back down, that's just not the way the world is going.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. Just one little quick thing. The debate they had in the Supreme Court about affirmative action, a girl at my kid's Jewish high school said, "Oh, it's good for us if they get rid of affirmative action." And I thought, no. That's how they're thinking.
Nadine, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
We're going to go to Eugene Major, who's an alum of Princeton. Eugene, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. So I'm curious if there are differences between what might be going on different campuses relative to, I guess, what you call the peak Jew and dynamism on campus and integration with other parts of campus. So I'm really only familiar with the kind of the Princeton situation, and definitely the overall numbers of Jews at Princeton is down as well. But I think there's an argument that at Princeton, the past decade actually might have been the best time ever to really be Jewish at Princeton. And I think that might have something to do with the Center for Jewish Life and Chabad really proactively reaching out to, every Jew they can find on campus. And, previously before that, they kind of Hillel waited for you to show up and come in the door, but they would never, God forbid, go out and find you. And now there seems to be a different dynamic, and they boast about reaching 75% of the Jews on campus. So I'm curious if even though the numbers are down, are there things that the Jewish communities on these campuses could do to maybe make the most of the lower numbers that exist today?
Yeah, well, and they're doing it. And at Harvard as well. I know I talked to Rabbi Steinberg, who made the point to me that they're getting about as many kids, COVID, allowing for the sort of COVID dip, getting about as many kids this decade on an average Friday night as they got maybe 30 or 40 years ago. I think the average Jew on a college campus is far more likely to receive outreach from, or meals from, or learning from Hillel, Chabad, Aish HaTorah, some sort of Jewish communal professional or a peer than 30 or 40 years ago. When my dad was at Yale, he was class of 67, so we got in under the quotas. It was probably 10% Yale, 10% Jewish, but that was 500 people. Probably 30 of them had an interest in Hillel. I mean, a really tiny minority, and most of them were just, assimilated Yaleys, as my dad certainly was. I don't think he had any notion of Jewish life when he was there, nor was he interested. So absolutely, the Jews who are there are more likely to receive outreach and to want outreach and be involved. And that's impressive. Hillel International, by the way, is a very impressive, and getting more so. I mean, it's a smart and nimble organization that is doing very, very good work. I've been very impressed, and I wouldn't say that unless I meant it. I mean, that's my journalistic impression. Um, but when the numbers are, again, under 10%, where they were once 25%, that's not a positive thing for people trying to promote Jewish community. The other thing is, and Princeton's been part of this conversation because it's had great success in getting graduates of Orthodox day schools, so Orthodox identified freshmen, to come to Princeton over the past decade or so. That seems to be a very fixed, if you want an Orthodox minyan, if you want to be a place that has a real demand for kosher food and where anyone can get a minyan who wants one, whether they're Orthodox or conservative reform, you need 10 Orthodox boys on campus, and really you need more because they're not all going to go to minyan all the time. So you need like 30 or 40 you need 60 Orthodox students, half of them boys, let's say. And the Ivy League schools fight over who those kids are coming out of a few day schools, because they have to be academically strong and they have to want to come. And so it's tough, but you are absolutely right that they are making more out of the population they have and getting more from, and doing more for, than they did 40 years ago.
Eugene,
Thanks.
thank you so much.
The irony, by the way, when I went to Princeton in the early '80s, we just had a minyan, so you had to go every time. You couldn't
There's
risk.
that.
So there is a benefit, but no, yeah, that's great to hear. Take care.
Thanks, Eugene. We're gonna go to a fellow Princeton alum or alumna, Lisa Saltzman, who's also got her PhD from Harvard and calling from just next door to my
Hello.
hometown in Ballackinwood or Narberth. Lisa, welcome.
Narberth. So yes, you've given my credentials that I was an undergrad at Princeton in the mid '80s and then was a grad student at Harvard, but I've now spent my career since 1994 teaching at a women's college, Bryn Mawr.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering, given that I have now become immersed in the histories of this sort of college as opposed to the Ivies,
Right.
if any research dealt with the Seven Sisters and whether their distinctive mission made them any different in terms of their admissions policies or experiences of Jewish students, or if they really just mirror their male counterparts.
So the first thing I should say is that although some of our later episodes were dealing naturally with co-ed schools, or schools that, like Cornell, that historically had been co-ed, Penn technically wasn't co-ed all of its existence, but it really was. Its women's college was so integrated, and Pembroke and Brown always had a very close relationship. But our early episodes on Princeton, Yale, our Dartmouth, are they're boys clubs. However, what I learned about some of the Seven Sisters, Pembroke was no better than Brown. Was just as likely to tell an Orthodox girl that she should take her exam on the Sabbath anyway, or maybe she should have gone somewhere else. Maybe she should be at Brandeis or City College. Barnard had a president, I believe her name was Virginia Gildersleeve, which is one of the all-time great Protestant Seven Sister presidential names, who was in some ways a very impressive figure, a semi-out lesbian, obviously an extraordinarily impressive intellect and career woman. And I believe the story on her is a virulent anti-Semite, much more, at least as bad as Nicholas Murray Butler was her peer at Columbia across the street. So no, I have not encountered any reason to suspect that women were better at this, at least in the first half of the century. So, but lots of people have said, make your next series on the Seven Sisters, and that's not unthinkable. We have to figure out if there's enough there. I mean, I was blessed in that there was a lot of good scholarship already, and we knew where to look with the Ivy League schools.
Great, Lisa. Thanks so much for joining us. I've got one final question here. A little trouble with the technicalities to bring him up. Raphael Sachs from Dartmouth, but he asks, how do you think the internal debate among Jews about Zionism has historically played out on campuses? should Jewish organizations try to stay out of the debate, or should they facilitate it?
Well, so, you have to remember that before World War II, most of American Jewry was anti or non-Zionist, right? So, Reform Jewry was, uh, you know, pretty committed to non-Zionism. And of course, the reason that they tend to call their buildings temples is because they're not awaiting the rebuilding of the temple in, in Jerusalem. So it's a name you can appropriate for a building in diaspora. And they were theologically quite, insistent that Jewish life was in the diaspora, and they were not waiting for the eventual return to the Promised Land, to a Promised Land. And of course, huge swaths of Orthodoxy were theologically anti-Zionist, as some swaths of Orthodoxy still are. So this would not have been much of an internal debate. I mean, Jewish life, to the extent it existed pre-war on these campuses, was mostly assimilated, or you might call reform affiliated Jewry, who would not have had a particular interest in Zionism, with some exceptions, of course. But it was not a debate on these campuses, as far as I know. Once Zionism became much more normative among American Jews, even I think it was not particularly controversial to be an Israel supporter until, in some spaces, until the 80s or 90s. Through the wars, the Six-Day War and then the Yom Kippur War, the Jews I talked to who were on campuses in those days, including some very, left-wing identified countercultural Jews, very interested in civil rights, very interested in the women's movement, very interested in, in early took an early interest in gay liberation. I mean, people of the left in every sense did not see any contradiction in those days with their Zionism, with their support for Israel, which of course was a favorite of people on the left because of its kibbutznik ways, because of the fact that it was basically a socialist society in many ways, and it was seen, not entirely wrongly as a liberation movement, as a people's liberation movement at a time when liberation movements were sweeping the globe. Once you get to 1982 or so, and then with the Second Intifada in 2000, 2001, and then of course, the past 10 years, that is when you would see these cracks be much greater on college campuses. As recently as, say, the 90s, when I was on campus, nobody saw any contradiction between being a highly affiliated Jew who probably could be taken to, who you might assume was a Zionist, and being a member of the campus left. Nobody saw that contradiction. These days, to the second question of what should Jewish organizations do, I mean, I take the position as a, in my, as a journalist, that's not my concern. In private life, as a dad, and as somebody who's active in my own shul, I really do take the IDF view of, we leave no Jew behind. And I feel like campus rabbinates and outreach have a responsibility to do compassionate and meaningful and open-hearted outreach to any Jew, no matter however they define themselves or their Judaism or their politics. So it concerns me when certain Jews feel written out of Jewish campus life because they're to the left on Israel, or conceivably, to the far right on Israel. I mean, I'm of the view that any speaker should be welcome most anywhere. I mean, I'm a pretty radical free speechist, and I think that's in the Jewish tradition. And so, my point of view of things is like massively big tents for Judaism, and not to be afraid of disagreement. So, but it's not my job. My job is to go report on this stuff and try to get kids to sleep.
Well, thank you so much. You've really done an extraordinary job reporting on this and answering our questions today. So we're very, very grateful. I thank again all of my colleagues at the other Ivy Hillels and Centers for Jewish Life. Thank you, David, for joining us and for falling asleep.
He's been great. He's snoring now. I don't know if you can tell. I think I'm going to be at Princeton December 2nd. I think is a Friday night. I might be getting that wrong, but I have an invitation to Princeton Hillel. And I've been doing a lot of speaking on this, and also on my Squirrel Hill book, my Tree of Life book. So, I'd love to hear from people who want to hear more. This was a delightful hour, but I love talking about this stuff. I feel very evangelical about it. So, Rabbi, thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you for being so generous here and for that invitation. Reminder to everyone, next week on Thursday evening, we'll have an interview with Nick Lehman from The New Yorker and former Dean of Columbia Journalism School, on processing the upcoming elections, and the following week, a program with 2 co-directors of Nick Burns's The United States and the Holocaust. But I wish everyone a good night. And Mark, thank you again so much.